Hi everyone, my name is Charity Clark. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Arizona. I wanted to start doing some videos to provide you with legal information about things that are currently going on and to help keep you informed, give you a legal perspective of things, and hopefully give you some information that maybe you didn't have that could be helpful to you. Today I want to talk to you about protesting. In 2020, we've seen a lot of protests, and they've been from all different sides of issues, all different types of people, all different groups. And protesting is a really important part of our right to free speech. It's something that can be used to raise issues to those in power that may otherwise be overlooked or not addressed as quickly as they need to be. So it's important that we have that right. However, there are a lot of laws that can be used and are used and have been used here in Arizona in order to stop protesting, to arrest people in peaceful protests. And so I wanted to go through those with you so you have a better idea of how that works. Myself and several of my colleagues have taken time to represent people who have been arrested during peaceful protests, and we've seen these actual offenses happen, or these charges actually come up in peaceful protests. So I wanted to go through them with you. The ones that we are typically seeing are disorderly conduct, blocking a thoroughfare, failure to obey a lawful order, and trespass in the third degree. These are some pretty basic offenses that are pretty easy for law enforcement to use to effectuate an arrest. Disorderly conduct is typically a class 1 misdemeanor. It's what I call the catch-all offense in Arizona, and it's charged pretty rarely because it is such a broad offense that it's really easy to meet the elements of it. Disorderly conduct involves an intent to disturb the peace of another person, or disturbing that peace with knowledge that you're disturbing somebody's peace. As you can already imagine, protests are in a way meant to disturb the peace because they're meant to raise awareness on an issue and to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable so that they pay attention to the issue. So you've already got the disturbing the peace is pretty easy to come up with when we're dealing with a protest. The next element is in a list of different things that you can do to disturb the peace that then create the offense of disorderly conduct. The first is engaging in fighting, violent, or seriously disruptive behavior. And this is the one that's most frequently charged. And that's because even fighting and violent, we all know what that means. But seriously disruptive behavior is really broadly interpreted. So it's just what a reasonable person would find disturbing. And that can go a long way. It has been interpreted by the courts as very, very broad. So it's easy to arrest somebody who is disturbing the peace using seriously disruptive behavior in a protest. That can just be yelling. Another element of disorderly conduct that can be charged is just even making an unreasonable noise. So that's just yelling really loud, that's banging on things, that's disorderly conduct as well. Another one is using abusive or offensive language or a gesture to another person that is likely to incite that person to physically retaliate against you. That's something that you can see happening in protests where protesters are engaging people who are passing by, or people who are passing by are engaging protesters. Either one of those individuals could be charged with a disorderly conduct. Really, the key in disorderly conduct when thinking about a protest is the protester engaging somebody else. Somebody not a part of that protest is typically the way that you're going to see this being charged. So a good way to avoid this charge is to not engage other people outside of the protest, and that includes law enforcement, having conversations with them or doing anything towards law enforcement that could be considered seriously disruptive behavior. Blocking a thoroughfare. This one is a fun one that we see quite a bit in protests, and it's a easy way for law enforcement to arrest people from peaceful protests. Because it doesn't involve doing anything to anyone, really. Blocking a thoroughfare is just without any legal privilege to do so. Somebody or a group of people recklessly interfere with the passage of any highway or thoroughfare by creating an unreasonable inconvenience or hazard. So you don't actually even have to inconvenience anyone, you just create a hazard. We've seen this with arrests with people leaving protests. So as they're leaving and they're walking to their car by themselves or in a group, walk across the street without using a crosswalk, or with even in the crosswalk, but when the light hasn't changed on the crosswalk for them to walk. And there have been several arrests for that. That's a really common one that they've been using in Phoenix for arresting people. It is a class 3 misdemeanor. So that's the lowest level of misdemeanor. Excuse me. But still a misdemeanor. And while typically in most circumstances something of this nature that's a class 3 misdemeanor or a low class of offense would be handled by providing the person with a ticket that would tell them to show up to court, much like a traffic ticket. In these cases, police are arresting people, taking them in, processing them through the jail, having them then released. So they're really utilizing these offenses as a way to limit people's protesting, to cause people to think twice about going back out and protesting, and making it a really uncomfortable experience for them. The other one that we have is criminal trespass in the 3rd degree. Criminal trespass in the 3rd degree is just entering and remaining unlawfully on a real property after a reasonable request to leave by law enforcement or the owner. This is something that's easy to happen. You're on real property for a protest. Law enforcement tells you to leave. You don't leave. You can be charged with criminal trespass, which is also a class 3 misdemeanor. Failure to obey a lawful order. This is a Scottsdale city code, so it's not an Arizona statute. It's limited to Scottsdale, but it's used a lot in Scottsdale. They like to use this one quite a bit. Failure to obey a lawful order is just refusing to obey an officer in discharge of his duty. So an officer says stop. You don't stop. That could be a failure to obey. Officer says to leave an area. You don't leave, or you leave and come back. That could be failure to obey. Those are all things that we've seen quite a bit with protesting. Another offense that we've seen that's a little bit more serious is riot, and rioting is a class 5 felony in the state of Arizona. And it's not necessarily what you think. Rioting isn't always, smashing windows, running around with flames or whatever. Rioting, the statute itself is much more broad. So it is with 2 or more people who are acting together. They recklessly use force or violence or threaten to use any force or violence and have the ability to carry out those threats. So force doesn't necessarily mean causing harm. Force is just any act of force. It's just broadly interpreted like that. Pushing by somebody, anything of that nature could be considered force, or even the threat of that is something. So it can be really broadly interpreted, which gives law enforcement the opportunity to arrest for riot, even when it's not really a riot in the sense that we would typically think of as a riot, and charge a class 5 felony, which is, class 6 is our lowest felony, class 5 is the one right above it. Now, in addition to these offenses that we've seen, law enforcement have also really stretched some other more serious charges to increase the charging on people. Things like obstructing a criminal investigation, which is the knowing use of force or threats of force to obstruct, delay, or prevent communication of information relating to the violation of any criminal statute. So doing anything that stops law enforcement from communicating to each other about things that are going on that they believe are offenses, that would be obstructing a criminal investigation, which is a class 5 felony. Now, there's a lot of other charges that we could go through, but I'm going to keep it kind of simple today and go through just those ones. But then what happens next is when there is an arrest, there's a number of additional charges that can come out of that and that do regularly come out of that. We see them often in these protests. So one is a refusal to provide a truthful name. You need to understand that if you are lawfully detained, so if law enforcement is arresting you or detaining you and they ask for your name, you are required to provide your name. If you don't, it is a Class 2 misdemeanor. It does require a lawful detention. That doesn't mean that the charge has to stick or it has to be that you actually did commit an offense. The officer just has to have reasonable suspicion to believe you committed offense and then detain you that way. This also could be a detention for civil traffic violation if they've stopped you as you're leaving a protest because you didn't use a blinker and you don't provide a truthful name. So some people in trying to exercise their right, they say, well, I don't have to provide your name. You do. If you don't, it is a Class 2 misdemeanor. Additionally, what we see when the arrests happen are a lot of resisting arrests and aggravated assault on an officer. Resisting arrest is just intentionally preventing or attempting to prevent a person who you know to be a peace officer, a law enforcement officer, who's acting under his official authority from effectuating an arrest. And you do so by either using physical force against the officer or somebody else, or any means that creates a substantial risk of causing physical harm, or passive resistance. So the first two, using or threatening physical force, or any other means that creates a risk of harm, those are Class 6 felonies. Now these are really broad too. Using or threatening physical force may seem pretty narrow, but really when it's implied or used, it's things like just moving your arm can be considered using physical force. And any other means that creates a substantial risk of causing physical harm. Now, physical harm in these cases is as much as just a scratch on an officer's finger. So anything you do that could cause an officer to have some sort of physical harm, that would be a Class 6 felony, a resisting arrest. Now, passive resistance is just the catch-all. Passive resistance is usually charged when an officer says, I tried to put so-and-so in handcuffs and I could feel them tense up. So that's a passive resistance. In protests, we see it with people just laying on the ground. They're not cooperating. They're not helping to put their arms behind their back, do the things that would make it easy for an arrest. That's a passive resistance, and that's Class 1 misdemeanor. So we see that charged pretty frequently in arrests for things like with protests. Usually the passive resistance, because it's so broad, it's really easy to get there. Aggravated assault on an officer is just intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly causing a physical injury to law enforcement. It's also placing that person in fear of physical injury. So this is something that we see in a lot of cases. If the person being arrested is not very cooperative and does anything to pull away from law enforcement, that's pretty often is going to get you up to an aggravated assault on an officer. An aggravated assault on an officer is a felony. It is a Class 5 felony. If there's any injury to the officer, it's then a Class 4 felony. And again, when we're talking about injury, that's something as simple as a scratch on the officer's hand. That's something I see a lot in my work is something happened and in the process of the arrest, the officer got a scratch. Not even sure where that injury came from, but it's enough for that then to be a aggravated assault. So, like I said, protesting is really an important thing, an important right that we have. It's helpful in raising issues and bringing attention to issues that may otherwise be ignored. If you go out and protest, I hope that you take some of the information that I provided you in order to avoid an arrest. It is possible to avoid these offenses when you're there for the most part. However, if you are arrested at a protest or after a protest, leaving a protest, be sure to contact an attorney right away. Don't answer any questions. You have the right to remain silent. You should exercise that right. Do your best to cooperate with law enforcement, to act respectfully in order to avoid additional issues and additional charges. It's important to know that law enforcement dealing with protests are oftentimes heightened, nervous, scared about what's going on, and concerned. This is not to say that all officers are bad or that all arrests at protests are unwarranted. But if you are arrested, you should contact an attorney. Those of us here on the defense bar, myself and my colleagues, we're very passionate about representing people who are arrested while exercising their rights. Additionally, this is just some information for those of you who don't go out and protest to understand that when you hear about the arrests that are happening at protests, it does not mean that these arrests are happening because these protests were violent or individuals were out there being lawless. The statutes are broad enough that even peaceful protesters can be arrested for offenses. So I think it's important for the public to understand that those numbers you hear about arrests at protests may be slightly skewed as to whether or not there was really serious criminal activity going on at that particular protest. So I hope this information was helpful to you all. If you have any questions about anything, just feel free to reach out and talk to me. I'm happy to talk to people about these issues and answer questions. Thanks for listening.